Okay, so I don't really think it's specially prepared, but I'm going to try and look at this from as sort of wider perspective as possible, and just go through a few ideas that I think are interesting and we need to consider. I think this is both organisations sound really, really fascinating. What for me is important though is the link between events like this and the kind of memes, if you like, where we come up with the ideas about how things can be different, and the possibility of some kind of meaningful political transformation. To understand that, I think we really need to understand the way our system of power has got very good at separating the personal and the political, that we live in what I like to call the cult of opinion, where it's good to have an opinion. You know, any view you have, it's fine. You know, the more divergent views you have in a society, the more kind of vibrant your democracy is meant to be. But that reality of what we think and what we discuss with each other often doesn't map on in any kind of productive way to the political change that we actually need to see. And that's, I think, where the Occupy movement and democratic reform and Simple come together. How can we go about actually mobilising people in such a way that we can get these ideas, which of course are sensible and of course loads of people when they come across them would agree with, how can we turn those into a politically potent force? And I absolutely agree with the Krishnamurti quote that we need to understand a problem to get rid of it, and that in fact in understanding the problem we can create the transformation we need to see. But for that to happen we need to understand how our culture is separated head and heart, and another way of putting that is thought and action. And this cult of opinion thing that I'm talking about is a system whereby we're encouraged to have our opinions but basically keep them behind closed doors. I've been for the last sort of 10 years roughly what's known as a domestic extremist. Has anyone heard that term? Domestic extremist? Oh, by the way, just coming out of my speech very quickly, one of the things, I don't know if you've seen any Occupy events happening, one of the things we do is hand signals, and they're actually based on, I think, American Sign Language, so that it's a very good way of people being able to show how they're responding to what's being said without interrupting the flow of what's being said. The way we normally do it is when somebody says something great, then we clap and stop and we wait and carry on. But this way, like by putting your hands, by waving your hands like that, even though it feels silly, like jazz hands we call them, you can show that you're kind of in agreement with what somebody's saying. If you're not very sure, you can be like, show a bit of doubt, or you really disagree, you can kind of do that. So it's a very good way of having a kind of interactive conversation without slowing things down. So how do we actually mobilise and get things moving? One answer is learn the lessons of the past. We've had all sorts of interaction on a kind of virtual level through Facebook, Twitter, internet, etc. But thus far that has done nothing really to dent the power of the 1%. The more we know about what's going on, the less it seems that we're actually seeing the change in policy. I think people understand that the banks are basically crooks and gangsters, but the way, and not personally, they don't mean to be that. I think in their own heads they probably think they're trying to do the right thing. But in terms of their actual effect on the world, they are gangsters and crooks. They are destroying life itself when you look at things like climate change. But we're not seeing the change we need to see. So going back to the past, what we need to remember is people physically mobilising makes a huge difference. And whether it's actually millions of people on the street or the meaningful threat of millions of people on the street, you look in this country at the end of slavery, rights of women, decent working conditions, free healthcare, etc. The amazing changes that happened after the Second World War in this country in terms of social provision of all sorts were because after the war millions of people were ready to mobilise. The powers that be knew that if they didn't bring about significant changes, there was a serious threat of sort of socialist revolution, etc. So the link between having the ideas that we have and working out how to put those into political practice, how to take our ideas from being things that are opinions that stay behind closed doors, or even come into rooms like this one and turn them into political change, that requires transforming this cult of opinion thing, having the courage to base what we think on compassion and realise that yes, every opinion is valid in the sense that everyone has a right to an opinion and we should listen to everybody and respect everybody as an individual, but we need to have the courage to fight for our opinions and actually come into public spaces that disrupt the functioning of power as it currently operates. And what is so special about Occupy, I think, is that
it's a model that is at once disruptive, but on the other hand, feminist essentially. And what I mean by that is that the sort of this is on a very broad brush level. If the masculine principle is problem, reaction, solution, do things one at a time, looked at one at a time. The feminine principle is relationality. You know, how do things actually fit together? Because we have all these great ideas about how things should change, but they're not actually changing because all of the relational features of our societies which compromise the chances of change. You know, I won't go into the issues of media ownership and informational control. I'd love to have had more time. But what Occupy does is at once be something that disrupts, especially in front of St Paul's Cathedral. It's this sort of...
Have to wrap.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to squeeze lots into it a little bit. Basically what I'm trying to say is that as long as people look at something like Occupy and think, that's interesting what they're doing, we're never going to get to where we need to be. The question is, how can we grow the relatively few thousands of people that are taking really sort of visible action for change, how can we link those people together in such a way that actually gets in the way of power? Because at the moment politicians will say one thing generally, which is roughly what we want to hear, and they will do another, which is what the powerful economic interests want them to do. If we want to actually bring together rhetoric and policy, we have to lever the powerful, and that means disrupting society, I think, compassionately, non-violently, conversationally, and democratically, having the conversations we need to have in public so we can show each other there are millions of us who care. And this goes back to the last thing I said, it goes back to the prisoner's dilemma thing, that as long as we think, oh well, I would like things to change, but not enough other people want things to change enough, so I would do it if they would, but they're probably not going to, so I won't. Actually coming out and demonstrating, manifesting the concern we have in public has to be the way to go. And I think what we're really talking about here is a compassionate revolution. The systematic elements of a revolution, because we do need systematic change. Vast swathes of the world are completely brutalized by our current system, but we need to do it with compassion. We need to resist the oppositionality of divide and rule. As long as we think violent, masculine type revolution, we're always going to be sidetracked by the divide and rule politics. So the more we can actually bring compassion, not just to our ideas, but to how we relate to each other, the more chance we have of changing things. And in terms of climate, we have very little time to do it. So let's be inspired to get together and do everything we can.
Thank you.